Technical Assistance Center, and we are really excited today to have a webinar talking about behavioral health, value-based payment readiness. We're specifically going to focus today on independent practice associations, or IPAs, but want to just make very, very clear that while this is one of the options for partnership arrangements, it's not the only option for partnership arrangements. And I'm going to take this opportunity to plug our networking events, which are coming up in 7 different locations around the state, in the city and also around the rest of the state. You should have gotten an email notice yesterday if you're on our listserv that allowed you to register for said events. If you have any problems registering for the events, feel free to email us at mictech.info@nyu.edu. But at those events, 2 things will be accomplished. One, we will give even more detail on kind of networking partnership opportunities and how one goes about setting up those structures and those kinds of things and what the options are really available. And second, the reason they're called networking events is you will also have opportunities to network with other providers in your region to explore these kind of partnership opportunities in anticipation of applying for funding from OMH and OASAS for the BMCCs, which are going to be coming out. Today, Brett Friedman from Ropes and Gray is going to lead us through the IPA discussion. Feel free over the course of the webinar to chat in your questions to the chat box, and we will keep all those on file. We will answer questions at the end so even if you chat them in right away, we will answer them at the end, and we will get to as many questions as we can. As we always do, our webinar today will be recorded and will be available on the mictech.org website within 24 to 48 hours after the webinar, after today. And so with that, I believe we're going to turn it over to Brett Friedman, who's going to take us from here. Thanks so much, Brett.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kleek, and thank you for the introduction. As Dr. Kleek mentioned, I'm Brett Friedman. I'm a partner here in the Healthcare Practice Group of Ropes and Gray, and in that role, I've had the privilege and pleasure of helping many providers contemplate their future under value-based payment. And as a component of that advising, the concept of independent practice associations, or IPAs, often comes up. And my goal here today is to demystify what an IPA is and what it does, what you can do through an IPA and why you might need an IPA, but a critical distinction that I think every attendee should consider is an IPA is only one vehicle, and an IPA does certain things, but it doesn't automatically do those things. So please pay attention to what we're discussing today, how that might apply to your organization, but to note at the outset that this is a general overview, and despite that I am an attorney, I'm not furnishing legal advice to any individual agency or organization that may be considering it, but hopefully through that I can give each of you some additional information that will help you consider whether an IPA is the appropriate vehicle through which to take advantage of the Behavioral Healthcare Collaborative funding. So the way I'm going to proceed in doing that is through, and we'll go through these pretty quickly, so we definitely save some time for questions, because questions always arise when discussing IPAs. But in terms of giving this group the overview, there's six things I'd like to cover. The first is, why are IPAs important to behavioral health value-based payment? They're essential strategic importance. I'll give you background on what IPAs are designed to do. That 3 is how you go about forming an IPA if you're not joining one that already exists. 4 is really a diagram, so pay attention for the pictures as to what an IPA looks like and what some of the considerations are when you try and map out the structure as part of a diagram. 5 is some key decision points that providers will have to consider when forming an IPA, corporate formation, governance, who participates, what type of operational support an IPA needs that's separate and apart from the day-to-day operations of your agency. And then I'll go through, and every good lawyer should, the legal considerations associated with forming an IPA. Of course, you implicate laws, primarily antitrust, and so there'll be appropriate admonishments there in that agenda item. So moving on to topic number 1, why are IPAs important in the context of behavioral health value-based payment? This webinar and McTack's work and what OMH and OASAS are doing is really informed by the Medicaid redesign team waiver in April 2014 and its desire to move almost all Medicaid payments to value-based payment by 2020. That mandate includes behavioral health services. It's been a slower transition, but like physical health, behavioral health is included as part of the Medicaid benefit package that is designed to transition away from pure fee-for-service to what the state deems to be value-based payment, and we'll discuss that very briefly, which is contained in the state's value-based payment roadmap. And so what value-based payment does is it places development and the contracting requirements on the Medicaid MCOs. And so while you as providers don't need to pursue your own value-based payment contracts, the MCOs have to start offering you value-based payment contracts. So where in the early stages you're going to get Medicaid fee-for-service rates in your contracts with HARPs and other Medicaid managed care organizations, the Medicaid managed care organizations under the mandate from the MRT waiver are going to start contemplating different value-based payment methodologies that are going to reward providers not just for the volume of services, but really for whether you're achieving better health outcomes and lowering cost for those Medicaid beneficiaries that you serve. There are 3 types of value-based payment methodologies that the state roadmap contemplates. The first is a basic, you get your fee-for-service rates, but you may get an upside against a historical benchmark for costs associated with those Medicaid beneficiaries you serve. Level 2 is, it's a similar concept. You get your fee-for-service payments, but there's both an upside bonus and also a downside risk if you don't achieve your shared savings targets in your arrangements with MCOs. And then level 3 is the most advanced, where you get a global or bundled payment for treating the beneficiaries, and you have to manage the care under that global budget. And the value-based payment roadmap, through its various iterations and in discussions with CMS, has evolved slightly, but the concept is that managed care organizations are going to contract with providers or collaboratives of providers to help implement these value-based payment relationships. And so that's really what the diagram's intended to show, is that the contracts may run with the providers themselves or through various types of provider collaboratives that are designed to integrate and be able to take on these type of value-based payment arrangements collectively. Initially, that was contemplated only as the performing provider systems under DSRIP, but as the value-based payment roadmap has evolved, that includes other types of collaboratives like IPAs or BHCCs and the like. This is just a timeline to show that in various phases, we're currently in the middle of the transition from fee-for-service to value-based payment, and the mandate says by 2020, so in 2.5, 3 short years from now, the state envisions and has committed to making 80 to 90% of all the payments that run from Medicaid managed care organizations to providers as having some element of value-based payment. So this is a reality, and this is what's driving the change in the care delivery system. And so it's incumbent, and I'm glad that the attendees of this webinar and all of McTack's other offerings is so robust, because things are going to change whether we like it or not, and having the information necessary to understand how the payments are going to change is critically important. What this means for individual agencies as providers, and a lot's already been going on as behavioral health providers ready themselves for value-based payment. But given the transition to value-based payment, providers are going to find it increasingly difficult to operate independently. Essentially, the status quo is no longer going to be the norm. And the reason why is, as an individual provider, you have a limited ability to influence the different types of care that your service recipients will receive. You can certainly influence the care that your agency individually delivers, but how are you going to link up that care with other providers across the spectrum? The second is, as you're moving to a Medicaid MCO fee-for-service rate environment, and if you don't have to be, if you don't have the scale or the necessity to be within a managed care organization's network, you may not get the type of recognition from an MCO, whether that's in terms of your rates, in terms of a contract willingness to negotiate the terms of your contracts. So building some scale to ensure that the contract best recognizes the value that your agency delivers to the Medicaid managed care organization's members is critical. The other reason why independence is hard in this environment is that the transition to value-based payment requires a tremendous amount of infrastructure to support the requirements surrounding value-based payment. Data reporting, data tracking, electronic medical records, all of those things are key. And as an individual provider, especially one that's been operating on Medicaid margins for a long time, it's difficult to find the capital that's necessary to invest in the infrastructure to support what you need to do to be successful in value-based payment, not just as an affirmative requirement to report out the data that you may have to do under the value-based payment contract, but to know whether if you're going to take on a value-based payment arrangement that it's going to be financially sustainable for your organization. So as a result, providers have, and in my experience advising clients in this area, two primary options. There's really there's any variations of these options, but these are the two sort of big buckets that providers are considering. The first is a corporate transaction, which is essentially to combine in some legal manner your organization with another, essentially build scale through a corporate transaction. So, and you've seen a lot of that in the current environment with smaller agencies merging with other smaller agencies or larger agencies taking over medium-sized or smaller agencies to essentially grow the combined balance sheet in a way where that combined enterprise has more weight for the reasons I mentioned. So there's fewer smaller providers and then, more larger providers. The other option, which is really the focus of this presentation and the BHCC model overall, is to collaborate. So your agencies remain as separate legal entities. Your balance sheets remain your balance sheets. But you collaborate strategically with other independent agencies in a way to pursue value-based payment arrangements. And that's what that's the crux of a BHCC and why an IPA, and I'll discuss the difference now, is really, the way you do that collaboration as an independent agency. So the hardest thing I find when starting to advise providers on value-based payment arrangements is, there's an alphabet soup. That you hear about PPSs and ACOs and IPAs and BHCCs and any other number of acronym-based terminology that is unclear how they relate to one another. Very, very quickly, PPSs are the construct under DSRIP for pursuing your 10 or 11 district projects in your geographic region. The value-based payment roadmap contemplates that PPSs are one model of pursuing Medicaid MCO value-based payment arrangements. A PPS can be an IPA, it can also be an ACO, but an ACO under New York regulation is a special designation that a provider collaborative will receive because it's going to pursue different value-based payment arrangements. And under the regulations that apply to state ACOs, obtaining ACO designation can achieve certain benefits under state regulation. And so an ACO is very much a specific thing, just like a PPS is a specific thing. An IPA is a little bit less specific, but an IPA is a legal designation, and I'll discuss this in a little bit more detail in the coming slides, but it's a legal designation that an entity obtains, and that legal designation allows the entity to contract on behalf of independent providers as part of managed care arrangements. And so an IPA can be an ACO, a PPS can be an IPA. These different collaboratives, they overlap. And then a behavioral health care collaborative is a newer construct from OASS and OMH as part of the funding. And an IPA can be a BHCC, but it could also be a lead agency that's working with other agencies as a way of pursuing value-based payment arrangements. And so again, an IPA is one construct through which a BHCC can form, but it's far from the only construct. I think there are benefits associated with the BHCC contemplating becoming an IPA, but as Dr. Kleek mentioned, and as you'll hear as part of the various networking events, there are many ways to do this, but to know whether an IPA is right for you, I think this presentation will help arm you with that information. But at the end of the day, I just want to say that regardless of the acronym you're choosing, the overall concept is the same, right? Which is that you as an independent agency, as an independent provider, are collaborating with other independent providers to achieve the objectives of value-based payment, improved health outcomes, better patient experience, lower cost, and approaching the Medicaid managed care organizations that have that mandate, and working with them in a mutually beneficial and collaborative way to achieve the objectives, better care at lower cost. And just to note how IPAs fit into this, DOH has recognized in the value-based payment roadmap that an IPA is a good vehicle to pursue value-based payment methodologies, and that in the policy paper and the notification of interest form, there is a contemplation that a BHCC could be an IPA. And so that's why, I was invited by MCTAC and OMH and OASS to help define what an IPA means and what it can do. And so slide 9 here gets into the definition of an IPA. As I mentioned earlier, an IPA is a special purpose legal entity. There's a provision under New York regulation that speaks to what an IPA is and what it can do. It's in Part 98 of the Code of Rules and Regulations, which deals with Medicaid managed care organizations. By achieving a special designation as an IPA allows the legal entity to do two things that other legal entities cannot do. The first is it can negotiate and contract on behalf of providers, independent providers. So if you satisfy certain legal tests, which I'll discuss later on, an IPA can actually sign a contract with a managed care organization on behalf of the providers that are affiliated or in the network of the IPA. And that's a really important power that an IPA has that other types of legal entities do not have, because otherwise the arranging for the services of Article 31 or Article 32 licensed providers would otherwise run afoul of the corporate practice of medicine restriction in New York State. But being an IPA is an exception to that. So if you're going to want to contract collectively with other independent providers as part of a single value-based payment arrangement, an IPA is a legal avenue to do that under specific provisions of New York regulation. The other thing an IPA can do is if you are in a level 2 or level 3 value-based payment relationship, which involves taking on the risk for the health outcomes and the costs of the Medicaid beneficiaries you serve as part of a value-based payment arrangement, if you're going to take that risk for losses with other providers that you're collaborating with, you can do that risk-bearing function through an IPA, and that's the recognized avenue for doing that. So when I advise providers as to whether they should form an IPA, I ask them two questions, which is, one, do you want to contract collectively as part of a single contract with a managed care plan? If they say yes, I said, well, ultimately you're going to have to do that through an IPA, so you might as well form an IPA now. The next question I ask them is, do you see yourself entering into an arrangement where you might be financially responsible if you can't achieve the objectives, the cost and care objectives set out in your contract? If they say yes to that, then I said, an IPA is also a good option to pursue because you can't do those things without forming an IPA. And so we really discussed this. The contracting function is the ability to arrange for the provisions of independent services or to arrange for the healthcare services provided through a network of independent agencies. And so if an IPA is going to negotiate collectively and contract jointly, then it needs to be done through a special entity that has the IPA designation. Same thing with risk-bearing level 2 or level 3 VVP arrangements. An IPA, too, it's, although those are special functions, an IPA can also do other things that don't relate to their contracting or risk-bearing functions. They can perform delegated administrative functions on behalf of the managed care organization, whether that's delegated credentialing, group purchasing for data systems, EMRs, care management tools, care management staff can all run through an IPA. And to the extent that you do a very complex risk-bearing arrangement, an IPA can be deemed and process claims under New York law. So if you have to pay out claims and settle claims to your downstream providers, that can also be done through an IPA. So how do you go about forming an IPA? It's a relatively straightforward and easy process to actually create the legal entity that becomes an IPA. It can be formed as any type of corporation or limited liability company under New York law. But then instead of just filing the paperwork with the New York State Department of State, you have to get a few additional regulatory approvals to do so. The New York State Department of Health has to approve your formation as an IPA. The State Education Department and the Department of Financial Services, they all essentially, you submit an application to them, they stamp it, and then you form the entity. That approval process is not materially affected by whether you're an LLC or a business corporation, and it usually takes about 6 months to get through the various state regulatory approvals. And what they're looking for is whether the powers and purposes of the legal entity meet the framework of the regulations so that you're doing the things contemplated as what an IP can do and not more and not less. And the IPA although the IPA itself goes through this approval process, it's not a licensed entity like an Article 31 or an Article 32 provider is. It's simply an entity that's designated with the IPA function. And under New York State law, an IPA has to be called either an independent practice association or an IPA. So if your form, its name of, it's what you want to call your IPA, and then it has to be called IPA. So you can identify an IPA because it says it in the name. And so this, again, goes through some of the more, minutia around how you go about forming an IPA. It's a relatively straightforward process, but it does take a bit of time to get through the different levels of approval where they review your corporate formation documents to make sure you're doing it correctly. It's important to hire a lawyer that's done this before, just because, knowing who to contact at the various state agencies, knowing how to, get the process in the right order through the various state agencies. Otherwise, you can take a 6-month process and make it into a year-plus long process, and it's important to have the legal entity formed if you're going to start collaborating through an IPA. So this is, on slide 15, this is what an IPA structure looks like. Up here in the middle on the left side of the slide, you see that if you want to form your behavioral health care collaborative as an IPA, here it would be an LLC, which is really the most common form. And we can discuss, if you want to go about forming it, the legal considerations about choosing a New York not-for-profit corporation versus an LLC versus a business corporation. But you form the IPA, and the IPA is usually owned by the providers that want to contract through the IPA. And that those owner providers also tend to be the downstream participating network providers within an IPA. It's not required that the owners of the IPA also overlap entirely with the participating providers in the IPA, but there often is a high degree of overlap. And then as you see in this model, the IPA is entering into a single provider agreement with a managed care organization. And that single agreement is essentially arranging for the network of behavioral health services that's being provided by the network agencies that participate through the IPA. The other option, which we'll discuss, is that instead of the IPA contracting on behalf of the downstream providers, they do something called the messenger model. And the messenger model is a way of negotiating rates for the downstream providers in a way that complies with antitrust principles because of a limitation that, and we'll get into this in a few slides because this is the complex legal analysis, is that an IPA cannot contract on behalf of independent providers unless you're financially or clinically integrated. And before you meet those tests, you have to do the messenger model so that each provider in the IPA doesn't know the individual fee-for-service rates paid to any other provider. So those are the two options in terms of the ways that the IPA will contract with an MCO on behalf of its provider network. And then the IPA, as I mentioned earlier, can also, through a management services agreement or an MSO agreement, perform certain delegated management functions on behalf of the managed care organization, whether that's utilization review, quality assurance functions, credentialing functions. So instead of the managed care plan credentialing the network providers, the IPA can credential. And so there's a lot of flexibility to the agreements that the IPA can work and negotiate with the managed care organization. These are some of the considerations in terms of how you form an IPA. And I discussed this a little bit earlier, but, do you want to form the IPA as a New York not-for-profit corporation, a limited liability company, a business corporation? There are pros and cons to each approach, which is a bit outside the, sort of the confines of this presentation, but it's one of the reasons why you need to consult a lawyer when forming an IPA, because these decisions matter. And what you envision the IPA doing immediately and in the future is going to affect the legal form through which you create the IPA. There's also different implications to choosing the type of legal entity. There's corporate line implications in terms of how that entity may operate, tax law, whether there's pass-through corporate taxation or double corporate taxation, and then securities laws, which is if you form as an LLC and and there's an expectation that the providers are going to earn a profit through the IPA, which is unlikely to occur for various reasons, you may actually have to treat it like a securities offering, which can get very complicated. So the legal form through which you form an IPA matters, and it's something that you need to weigh the pros and cons before you make the decision to go ahead and form. I've unfortunately been involved in situations where providers have already formed an IPA, and then we need to dissolve it and reform it as a different vehicle because they made the wrong decision at the outset. In addition to selecting the corporate form, you have to create governing documents, whether they're your corporate bylaws or whether they're an operating, a management agreement that determines, how the IPA is going to be structured. So are you going to limit the IPA to just behavioral health providers? Is it going to be a combination of OMH and OASAS licensed, only OMH, only OASAS? Is it going to be physical health and behavioral health together? How do you want the governance of the IPA to work? So who sits on the board? Who are the owners? What decisions require what approvals? We'll go into that in a little bit more further detail in the coming slides. And in terms of how do you want to open up the IPA? Do you want to limit the IPA to just the owners? Do you want some owners and some non-owners? Do you want to open up the IPA to anyone who wants to join the IPA? And so there's different levels of exclusivity, essentially, that providers can form the IPA, and there may be reasons to have a broad IPA or there may be reasons to have a narrow IPA. And so this goes into the governing documents. So, looking a little bit, in terms of the members or the owners of the IPA, what powers should they have in terms of, how the IPA is governed and operated? Can they appoint and remove governing body, board members? Who gets to decide who sits on the really important committees? Do you want to, who decides which new providers get to come in and get credentialed through the IPA? Who gets to appoint the officers and managers of the IPA, the CEO, the executives, also the not just the corporate officers, but also the board officers. Who gets to decide, whether the IPA takes on new initiatives, entering into new contracts, deciding on the parameters of how the providers are going to integrate, what geographies the IPA will operate in, as well as major corporate actions as to whether the IPA is going to join with another IPA or dissolve, if you're going to charge dues to the providers, and how shared savings may be distributed. These are some of the sort of critical governing documents. Here on this slide is a list of the types of committees that an IPA often has, and these are critical to the functions an IPA plays in its relationship with managed care organizations. So in addition to some of the basic corporate governance committees that you're going to have normally in any corporate entity, an IPA typically has a clinical quality improvement committee that creates the clinical protocols and enforces them, credentials new providers. That's essentially ensuring that you can deliver on the parameters of your value-based payment contract. There's going to be a contracting committee which determines which managed care plans and on which terms you're going to enter into value-based payment arrangements. And then you may also have an innovation and risk sharing arrangement committee, which is going to solicit whether there's different pilots or demonstration projects the providers in the IPA want to participate through, and doing the analysis for various value-based payment or risk arrangements to make sure that the IPA members are capable of taking on the value-based payment. The next critical decision, and one that should never be overlooked, is an IPA takes money to work, right? You need, whether the IPA is going to be the vehicle in which you invest on a interoperable or common electronic medical record, hiring consultants or other lawyers to, help get the IPA ready for value-based contracting, determining the best methodology for distributing, if this is part of a value-based payment arrangement, the funding that you get from OMH and OASAS to become a BHCC, and then distributing the revenue that the IPA earns as part of an upside shared savings arrangement or as part of other, bonuses or other types of additional payments you get by virtue of being of contracting for a value-based payment arrangement through an IPA. Those require, careful decisions among the owners and operators of the IPA to make sure that all the providers are happy and agree upon the construct that you create. The IPA also can, the critical agreement that governs the relationship between the IPA and its network or affiliated providers is something called a participation agreement. So it governs the participation that a provider has in the IPA, and it's a critical document. It actually needs to be approved by the New York State Department of Health before you enter into any managed care arrangements. So a lot of it's boilerplate, but it does cover certain elements that are really critical to understanding the role that the IPA is going to play in the contracting with managed care organizations. So, here are some of the provisions that I typically include in the agreements between the IPA and its network of providers. How MCO contracting is going to work and how negotiations are done. Is it messenger model or is it going to be a single signature contract? And there's legal reasons to do it one way or the other. What required technology or linkages or interoperability are the providers in the IPA going to have? And that's often a function of ensuring that the providers are going to be capable of meeting the demands of the value-based payment arrangement they have with the managed care organization. How referrals will work among the providers. So there's often a close referral relationship within an IPA to make sure that you keep things within the providers that subscribe to the clinical care protocols and can achieve the value-based payment objectives under the contract. So there'll often be a directed referral process and an in-network referral process. Credentialing which providers are qualified to participate. What are the key parameters of making the providers in the IPA clinically integrated so that they can achieve the objectives of value-based payment, but also, achieve the quote-unquote clinical integration that allows for joint contracting through the IPA. whether they want to, how financial integration or risk-sharing contracts will work, when the IPA is permitted to enter into them on behalf of the providers, and whether the IPA is going to do other types of services for the providers. Critical services are marketing, public relations, directory, so, sort of advertising who's in the network, selling that network to the managed care organizations. I discussed a little bit earlier sort of the exclusivity of the IPA. So is this the only IPA that a provider can choose to participate in? It's very uncommon to have total exclusivity, although it's possible. You can also have a right of first opportunity where if you're participating in the IPA as a provider, the IPA has a first opportunity to negotiate the managed care contract for that provider before the provider can enter into a managed care arrangement. It's individually or through a different IPA. You can have a notification requirement where the IPA sort of gives you the opportunity, but there's no right of first opportunity. There's no, there's no obligation to participate through one IPA or individually or through another IPA. And then none, which is, participation is entirely voluntary and open. So, if you decide to create or join an IPA, you're going to get this participation agreement, and it's going to have these provisions, and you need to look at the participation agreement very carefully to make sure you know the level of exclusivity, what the obligations are on the provider for participating in the IPA and what the IPA is going to do for you. There's some other sort of critical provisions, which is how the IPA negotiates, and there are two common options, and there's antitrust considerations that balance each. Whether it's opt-out, which means that you're in a contract that the IPA negotiates unless you tell the IPA that you don't want to participate. You have to opt out affirmatively, or you can opt in, which is the IPA presents a contract to the provider, and the IPA and the provider has to affirmatively elect to say, I want to participate. And there's pros and cons to either an opt-in or an opt-out approach, but that's something that's going to be in your participation agreement. And then the dues, oftentimes there'll be dues a year that a provider has to pay in to fund the activities of the IPA, the sort of the shared costs. And so paying attention to those dues provisions is a pretty critical item of any participation agreement. The IPA provides a lot of operational support, and that level of operational support follows a typical path. When an IPA is formed, there's usually few independent resources. There's a lot of time devoted by the providers that own or have formed the IPA to make sure they're leveraging, existing health home work or other work, developing clinical protocols. It's really a commitment of time and startup capital. Then what happens, and we'll discuss it, is the IPA moves to messenger model contracting. It presents itself to managed care organizations, and the IPA starts arranging for contracts with its providers. And then after a year or two plus, after significant staff and resources have been invested, the IPA can really, what we call full integration, jointly contract on behalf of the providers. It'll be generating revenue through delegated management services, or because it's doing really well under its value-based payment contracts with its providers. And at that point, you've spent a lot of time and money to make the IPA successful. A lot of IPAs fizzle out at the startup stage if the providers aren't committed to really making it work. Sort of many make it to the messenger model stage, and then I've seen a lot of IPAs stall out in trying to get from the messenger model stage to full integration, because each one of these steps requires a lot of commitment from the providers to make it successful. And this is not, it's not simply a provider joining an IPA and letting the IPA do its thing and you're sort of getting the benefits. It's really an investment of both time and money by an agency and its senior executive staff and its programmatic staff to make sure the IPA meets your needs and can be successful in the value-based payment environment. So, it's very, very rarely will you be able to plug in immediately to an IPA and achieve the benefits. There's a real dedicated commitment of time, effort, and capital. Switching very quickly to the legal considerations and I won't spend more than 5 or 6 minutes with these just because these can get quite complex, but it's important to know that there are many legal considerations involved in formation of an IPA, more than just picking the corporate form and developing the governance. Antitrust is the biggest legal roadblock for achieving the aims of an IPA. And the reason why is that an IP, because, and as I discussed earlier, each of your agencies is remaining as an independent provider, and you're all operating, you're all essentially under the view of the antitrust regulatory authorities, the Attorney General and the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C., you're competitors. And so if you start collaborating and using that collaboration to achieve leverage and bargaining power in negotiating with managed care organizations, that may be viewed as quote-unquote horizontal price fixing, and it's a potential antitrust violation. There are ways to achieve compliance with antitrust laws through an IPA, and those things are called clinical integration, and you'll hear these terms a lot in an IPA context. Clinical integration, financial integration, messenger models, and then there's different state mechanisms to get immunity from antitrust law. But clinical integration means that you are so clinically related to one another that you're pursuing efficiencies, you're sharing clinical care protocols, and your care is so intertwined in terms of how you do things that you have to contract jointly to achieve those objectives. Financial integration is that you're bearing risk collectively, and so because you're bearing risk collectively, pursuant to a level 2 or level 3 value-based payment arrangement, the antitrust authorities allow you to contract jointly. Messenger model I discussed a little bit earlier, but as opposed to the providers negotiating jointly for their rates, each provider is really negotiating independently, and the IPA is acting as a messenger of those rates individually to each organization that participates in the IPA. So one agency never knows exactly the rates that the other agency is getting paid, and that preserves the risk of horizontal price fixing. And then there's various avenues, COPA and becoming a state-authorized ACO, that one of the benefits is the ability to receive immunity, state action immunity from antitrust authorities. This is what some of the parameters. Clinical integration is the most common route to achieving, to achieving and allowing the IPA to jointly contract on behalf of the providers that participate through the IPA. And you have to do, a combination of the things on this slide: utilization review, quality assurance, performance evaluation of the providers, data gathering and analysis, making capital investments, having a common EMR, doing some sort of care coordination which can relate to or be separate from health homes. Health homes can, there's the Health Home Administrative Services Agreement that's part of the MCO, but an IPA often does its own separate care coordination, but there's a lot of familiarity there. Clinical integration takes time and effort. It's usually a 1 to 2 or longer process to be considered clinically integrated enough to achieve and to be allowed to do joint contracting through an IPA. Financial integration is one of those, it's pursuing a level 2 or level 3 value-based payment arrangement. You can negotiate that risk arrangement through an IPA, and that allows you to negotiate collectively because the FTC and the AG, just like New York State, wants provider collectives to pursue risk arrangements because it's going to improve quality and lower cost. But if you decide to use an IPA and you haven't achieved substantial clinical financial integration, you have to use the messenger model as I described before. So you're not negotiating collectively, but you're really negotiating individually, but the IPA is facilitating the negotiation process. And there's various forms of the messenger model. This is very technical stuff, and it's something where you want a capable and knowledgeable antitrust attorney to advise an IPA on how to do it right. But you can do it, what's called the traditional messenger model or a modified messenger model, which really makes the rate negotiation process easier for independent providers and does, add simplicity to the process, but needs to be done just right to avoid an antitrust violation. And as I mentioned, there are various, and these are relatively recent regulatory avenues, which were an outgrowth of the district program, where the state acknowledged that these antitrust laws are complicated, and providers who want to remain independent can really run afoul of antitrust laws without knowing it. And so by becoming a state-designated ACO or applying for and receiving a Certificate of Public Advantage or a COPA, doing so can help you, part of the benefit of doing so is receiving state action immunity. So you can do things through an IPA that's designated as an ACO or a COPA with knowing with certainty that you're not going to be subject to prosecution by antitrust authorities. I won't get too deep into it, but there are specific regulatory requirements if you want to designate your BHCC or IPA and or IPA as an ACO. It's a state application process, and that's something that any IPA should consider depending on what its strategic growth plans are. Same thing with a COPA. A COPA is different than an ACO because it's not a designation, but you're pursuing a cooperative agreement, which is really your IPA provider agreement. And by virtue of having a cooperative agreement, you can apply to receive COPA designation, and that COPA designation can give you, again, protection from antitrust laws. COPAs have been pursued by many performing provider systems for achieving their district projects. Like a PPS would do it for their district projects, an IPA would do it for its clinical integration program, which would give them the ability to jointly contract for an MCO arrangement. This is a comparison of the differences between COPAs and ACOs. Again, this is quite technical, and I won't. I want to be sure I leave enough time for questions, so I won't go through this slide in tremendous detail. But just to know that these are two different types of programs that you can use to lessen the antitrust risk associated with an IPA process. A COPA requires a cooperative agreement. It's approved by DOH and the Attorney General of New York State. It requires as a prerequisite a showing of clinical integration based on some of the factors I had on one of my earlier slides. It doesn't impose any specific governance requirements, but just that you have a cooperative agreement. And it does provide for antitrust protection. An ACO is a bit different. It's its own application process. You get a certificate of authority as an ACO and a designation as an ACO. It's granted by the Department of Health in consultation with the New York State Department of Financial Services. It also requires clinical integration. It does require specific governance. So it needs to be 75% provider governed at least, and there's also some financial requirements to become an ACO and achieve a certificate of authority. And it does grant you a similar antitrust protection under state law, and it also protects you from other New York State regulatory authorities which complicate the distribution of savings within an ACO, like the prohibition on fee splitting or state-specific referral limitations. So there's a lot to digest here, but I want to conclude that an IPA, and as Dr. Click mentioned, is one avenue. The IPA really has the benefits of being a long-recognized, regulatorily sanctioned vehicle for pursuing arrangements with managed care organizations, whether they be joint contracted or risk arrangements. And so if you as an independent provider join an IPA to pursue a value-based payment arrangement, an IPA is it's an entity-based vehicle that can really help in that process. but the admonition I want to give is an IPA, starting an IPA from scratch is a lot of work. It requires an investment of time, capital, commitment. It's a formation of a new legal entity, and it should not be done. It's not the panacea that just by having an IPA is going to get you somewhere. It's the IPA as the tool to achieve the clinical aims and integration objectives that will allow you with your fellow behavioral health providers to achieve common goals of improving care and lowering cost. And so you need to pick your IPA partners carefully, just like you should pick your behavioral health care collaborative partners carefully. And if you choose carefully, you can certainly do that through an IPA, and an IPA is a recognized vehicle to have those contracts with the managed care plans. And so I'll stop there. I think there's at least 6 minutes left for some questions, and in addition to any clarifications that OMH or ASAS may want to make to what I just said. So happy to answer questions in the last 5 minutes.
Fantastic. I just want to open it up. This is Andy again. I just want to open it up to OMH or OHS if there's anything they want to share or add to this before we dive into questions.
No, that was great.
We really want to leave time for those questions. Oh, sorry, Stefan.
All right, very good. So for folks in the audience, we've got a couple questions to start out, but I also want to ask them to actively send in any questions to the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. We've got a couple in the queue already, but also if you're on the line and you have questions, please send them in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the next 5 minutes. So I have what might be a pretty narrow question, but one that we've heard actually several times. Is there any reason why a county-based, county-owned clinic or county-operated clinic would be prohibited from joining an IPA?
Unless there's a provision of state law that I'm not aware of, no, right? I mean, if the IPA or county, or if the county-owned clinic is going to be subject to the requirements of value-based payment, the goals of value-based payment really encourage that county-based clinic to pursue the integration activities with their fellow providers in the geographic area. So, as what IPA participation really means is you're entering into a contract with the IPA, and you're going to pursue your value-based payment initiatives through that IPA. And if the county-based clinic has that legal authority under its, enabling or designation, regulation, it should very well be able to and should participate through an IPA.
All right, great. Another kind of granular question real quick. For the COPA, do you already have to have achieved clinical integration or merely commit in writing to clinical integration?
That's an excellent question. The application asks you to describe your clinical integration program. And so, what I've advised other providers in this sense is you may not have had to perfect your clinical integration program to get your COPA and your ACO, and in fact, ACOs and COPAs have received authorizations and have not been fully clinically integrated, but I'd say you need to have started it and been on the road and have a clear objective for finishing.
Okay, so just the idea that you would form an IPA one day and get your COPA the next day would probably be a stretch.
I think it would definitely be a stretch. I think you would form your IPA one day. And, the IPA formation process can come after the clinical integration process has begun, right? You can start, one way this could proceed certainly is, you meet a group of fellow providers at the MCTAC networking events. You decide to start meeting, and you discuss around the room what your clinical integration program would receive. One of the lead agencies receives the funding as the BHCC and distributes it among the people in that room. And then ultimately you form the IPA as the vehicle to pursue the initiatives that the informal BHCC construct has been doing for some time. And so, I think the more precise statement is to say, the providers that are clinically integrating need to have spent a good amount of time clinically integrating before they seek a COPA.
Gotcha.
It's often I've seen providers themselves do an excellent job creating the construct of a clinical integration program, but there are some excellent consultants in the field that, especially in behavioral health, have been have been advising behavioral health, non-behavioral health providers achieving clinical integration for some time.
All right, fantastic. So I'm going to try to do a couple quick ones because we got 2 minutes left. Can you start as a BHCC, then eventually transition into becoming an IPA? I believe the answer to this question is yes, because the BHCC is merely a mechanism for funding this, but I just wanted to say that out loud.
That's right, yeah. Okay. It depends where the providers are and how they want to seek BHCC funding. I know several large behavioral health providers have already formed IPAs, an IPA is certainly a construct to seek the BHCC funding that already exists, but you can also, pursue the BHCC through another mechanism and then ultimately form the IPA to pursue the contracting opportunities. One really good example of this is DSRIP. DSRIP, there were PPSs. Most PPSs are not IPAs, but they'll have to become IPAs when they want to start moving to contracting with MCOs, because that's the recognized legal vehicle to pursue, to enter into the contract. And so, it's funny because, the PPS is all formed, they're pursuing their clinical initiatives, and now, as they're starting to approach Medicaid managed care organizations for value-based payment, they're recognizing they need the IPA vehicles to do so.
Fantastic. So we're going to do one more last question as we're hitting the 12 o'clock hour. Is there any prohibition legally from an agency to be involved in more than one IPA?
No, there's not. I would say it gets complicated practically sometimes, because if you're pursuing clinical integration through an IPA and then you pursue clinical integration from another IPA, it's unlikely that what it means to be clinically integrated is the same from IPA to IPA. You have to look at your participation agreements and the exclusivity requirements or the exclusivity language in the participation agreements, because you don't want to have, you can't sign one agreement with an IPA that conflicts with another IPA agreement. So if one IPA requires full exclusivity, you're prohibited by that contract from participating in another IPA. It's unlikely, and I would advise any IPAs that retain me against having pure exclusivity, because it's very hard to pass muster in antitrust. But let's say there's a right of first opportunity, which is more common. If you have two IPA agreements that have a right of first opportunity in them, you can't give two different organizations the same right. And so again, there's no prohibition, but it gets complicated from pursuing clinical integration. And it gets complicated because you need to mine the contractual obligations under both pretty carefully. What is more typical is that if you're a provider and you have operations in multiple geographic areas, so let's say you operate in New York City and Queens, or Queens and Nassau County, or you extend across multiple service areas in the upper regions or the western regions of the state, then you can limit your IPA participation geographically, because as DSRIP recognized, a lot of clinical integration and creating the linkages and referrals necessary to improve health outcomes is a geographic exercise. And so I've seen providers participate in multiple IPAs that don't overlap in their geographic reach. Gotcha.
All right, well, on that note, thank you very much, Brett, for joining us today and really laying out in great detail exactly kind of what the factors are associated with an IPA and all the details and all that kind of stuff. Just one final plug. There were a couple questions here around where can you meet other providers. So just one final plug that we're going to be doing these networking events around the state where you'll have a great opportunity to meet other providers as well as get more detail on IPAs and other legal structures. So I want to thank everybody, especially Brett, for joining today, and really encourage everybody on the line to sign up as an agency to attend one of the networking events in your region. So thanks again, everybody. Thanks again, Brett, and we look forward to seeing everybody soon.
And I'll be at the New York City and Long Island event, so please say hi if you see me there.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.